Hey everybody, welcome to the introduction to Max. If you've done this introduction with me in person, we're going to cover that same material again, plus some additional material because we're going to have a little bit more space to do so in this format. Additionally, there are going to be some things that I cover differently than I covered them in person because there are better or more optimal ways to do some of the things that I showed quickly. I'm going to show you more detail and different approaches in this tutorial. So please build everything along with me as I do it, pause and rewind as needed, and certainly send me any questions that you have. So here we are in Max. Right now there's no windows open, but Max is still running. We can go to File, New Patcher, and that creates the patcher, which is our workspace in Max. That's where we build everything. And Max starts us with the blank screen. It makes no assumptions about where we're going to begin, about what we're going to build. We can start with sound, we can start with image, we can start with 3D graphics, we can start with music, physical computing, and combine any of those elements within the patcher to create the software, to create the application that we want to. And we can be playful and improvise and discover things, and it's a wonderful playground for the artist working in digital media. So a few housekeeping things before we begin. Under the options menu, make sure segmented patch chords is checked. This will make patching much easier and quicker. Also, use a mouse. Don't try to use Max with a trackpad. It can be done, and it's fine in a pinch, but you're going to work a lot faster, and your fluency with the Max interface will develop more quickly if you're using a mouse. So I strongly encourage that. In our patcher, we want to look at the format. So we click this little format paint bucket here. Opens up the format window. We want to be in a monospace font, like Monaco. If you don't like Monaco, there's Courier, there's Andel Mono. There's a lot of monospace fonts because we want all of our letters to be the same width, and we want spaces to be the same width as our letters for readability on the screen, because spaces are very important in Max. And make the font size a little bit larger. It makes your patches much easier to read. We can save these settings in a template. So you say create template, call it whatever you want, and say it's the default for new patchers. And that way you don't have to change these settings each time you create a new patch. So right now we're in the patcher and it's in edit mode. It's unlocked. If we take a look down here in the lower left corner, we see there's a lock icon, and it's unlocked at the moment. That means that we can edit our patch. And a very simple thing we can do, we'll start with sound, is take some audio files and drag them into our patch. And they create the playlist tilde object, which has our sound files. Each one has a play button and a loop button associated with it. I can make a comment. And you want to put lots of comments in your patches, particularly in the beginning. I can create a comment by hitting the C key. And making a comment, I can drag that comment around. Make another comment, and just note that this is the playlist tilde object. And I can move things around, I can resize them because my patcher is not locked. And as soon as I lock my patcher, now I'm interacting with the objects. So if I click on them now, I'm creating a playback and a loop range. I'm activating the play button. I'm activating the loop feature. And if I want to begin editing again, I just click my lock button and I'm back in edit mode. Two other ways to move between locked and unlocked are command clicking in blank space or hitting the keystroke command E for edit. We're in editing mode, hit it again, that toggles us into locked mode. So back in editing mode, we have our sounds in here. In order to hear them, we need a sound output device. So if you go up to the Add Object plus on the top bar, click it, go to the Audio tab, we see there's a speaker icon. This is the ezdac tilde object. We'll create one of those, and it'll create a speaker icon in a box which represents the sound output of the computer. We'll comment that. That's the ezdac. Easy because it's a simple graphical object, and DAC meaning digital to analog converter. It's taking the digital sound from these files and converting them into analog sound. And we need to connect these things together, and this is how Max works. We connect the output of one object to the input of another object. And the output, or the outlets, are always on the bottom of an object. So we see here we have 5 outlets of the playlist tilde. And when we hover the mouse over them, we get a help window that shows us what they do. So this is playlist signal channel 1. That's the left channel of sound that's coming out of the object. If we click there, it creates a patch cord. And if we hover that patch cord over the inlet of another object, here we see this is the ezdac signal start stop audio out channel 1. We're not worried about the signal start stop right now, but the audio out channel 1 is what we want. So we click there, and this connection is formed. And that's our left channel of sound. The second outlet of playlist tilde is channel 2, or the right channel of sound. Click there, it creates the patch cord, and if you click again, it's going to create a bend in your patch cord. And this is what segmented patch cords, this is part of what segmented patch cords does. And if you're happy with those bends, you can make that connection. But if you're like, oh, that's messy, you can simply hit the delete key, and it'll delete the patch cord, and you can make it again. If you get a patch cord that's not doing what you want, and it's not connected to anything, you can simply hit the escape key, and that will remove that patch cord. So here I've connected the output of the playlist to the input of the ezdac by using the first 2 outlets of the playlist tilde and the 2 inlets of the ezdac. These other outlets have other functions, and we're going to use some of those. So you want to be mindful of using the correct outlet for what you're intending to do. This is the sync outlet. We're not trying to sync anything together at this moment. These are playback notifications, which are very useful, but we're not going to use them at the moment. And this is a dictionary that relates to the files that we've loaded and the settings about them. So if we lock our patch, we're still not able to play the sound because our signal, our digital signal processing network, the audio portion of Max, is not on. So we just click that to turn it on, and you see the play buttons light up, indicating that we're now ready to play the sound. And from the playlist tilde, you can only play one sound at a time. So when you switch between different sounds, the first sound will stop playing and the next one will start playing. The selection will select what part of the sound is played. It's also setting the loop in and out points for when we're in loop mode. We can also add sounds to our playlist by taking a sound file and dragging it over the playlist tilde, and the blue indicates where the sound is going to go. So this new sound file is going to go between 1 and 2. If I drop it in there, there's the new one in position 2, and it shoved all the bottom ones down. I can also replace any sound file by just dragging right over the sound, so it's highlighted, and drop it, and I already have that one, and it replaces it. Replaces the sound. So this is simple and straightforward. and we have a file here that we can save in the normal way, but it's not the ideal approach. And I'm going to show you a different approach to everything that we just did, because if I right-click on a sound, which is also, by the way, how we remove it or reveal it in the Finder, note the path to this sound file. It's the absolute path. My hard drive, my user folder, my Dropbox, etc., etc. And this is fine for me, but this is not shareable. I can't send you this patch because this playlist tilde is looking for these sound files on my hard drive, and you don't have my hard drive. So there's another structure in Max that allows us to make things much more easily transferable. So just close this patcher, don't save it. We'll just rebuild that stuff in a minute. And this time we're going to say new project. We're just going to call up a save dialog, which allows us to create a new project folder. 7741 tutorial 1. And by default, it wants to put this inside the documents folder, inside the Max8 folder, in the projects folder. That's fine. You can save it anywhere you want, anywhere you know you're going to find it. So I save that, and it creates this window, this project window. And this gives us a much more optimal way to create our patches in a shareable form. Just take my sound files that I want to work with, and I drag them into my project. And now they're in the media category of my project. And when I create a new patch, instead of going up here to new patcher, I'm going to go down here to the plus in my project window and add a file to my project. I'm going to add a new file. And again, it gives me a save dialog asking where I want to save that patcher, and it defaults to the project folder. And we see there's already a file in there called tutorial1.maxproj. That's the project file information that relates to what's happening in this window. And we're going to create a new file that's a maxpat file, a patcher file, inside the same folder. And now we get our same familiar patcher window, but this time we can drag our sound files in from the project window. And it's not as convenient because you can only put in one at a time, but the benefit is tremendous, because now if I lock my patch, I right-click, it says remove, and then it just has the file name. This is a relative reference that points to the file in the project. So now with one more small step, this becomes a shareable project that you can move to another computer, send to someone, and they're going to have all your files. If we take a quick look inside the project folder by clicking Show Project Folder, here's our 7741 tutorial 1 folder. Go inside there. The sound files aren't in there yet. They're in the project, but they're still referring to the files that are elsewhere on the disk. And that's fine for the moment. But when we're ready to share this, we want the sound files to be copied into the project folder. So we do that by saying Manage Project, Consolidate. And now, when we look at our project folder again, we see there's now a media folder, and it has a copy of all of our sound files in it. So at this point, it's shareable. So now we can just rebuild. I'm going to unlock my patch, make a little space here, rebuild my sound output by adding an ezdac, make the connections, lock the patch. If the sound is not on, turn it on, and we have a functional patch again. We can create another playlist tilde object by dragging in some other sounds. And when we have two sound sources, like two playlist objects, we can very simply mix the audio together simply by connecting the outlets of the objects together at an inlet. This will mix the left channels of audio. This will mix the right channels of audio. So now when we lock the patch, we're going to hear both. And of course, something that we might want to do here is adjust the relative volumes of the sounds. So I'll introduce a new object, and we'll create it with a new keystroke. The N key will create a new object, and we're going to create the object live.gain tilde. And this is a simple volume control. And see how I made it a little bit wider? Because when you create a live.gain at first, these outlets are really close together at the bottom, and it's a bit hard to navigate. So just get in the habit of making an object wider if it has closely spaced outlets at the bottom. And I'm going to take my cables, and I can delete them and redraw them into the live.gain. That's fine. I can also click at the end of the cable and just move it over. I can also hold down the Option key, click and drag over the cables to select multiple cables and move them in a pair, which is very handy. I can use the Option key to duplicate, so I can Option, click, and drag to make another live gain. Another way to do that is click to select, and then Command D will duplicate. Or you can certainly just hit N and put in another live.gain. And you'll find this is very common. There's typically, and this is true of any well-designed software, there's typically always three ways to do any common command. And this is so that you can use the one that you remember most quickly and use the one that's most suited to your workflow. If you enjoy keyboard shortcuts, that's great. If you enjoy modifier keys and the mouse, these options are there for you. So Option, click, and drag over the patch cables to select them, drag them up. And now here we have 5 outlets again, so we want to be mindful of which outlet we're using. The first outlet, the leftmost outlet, is signal channel 1. It's our left channel of sound. And here's our signal channel 2, right channel of sound. And see there, I accidentally made a segment in my patch cord. So I can just make a new one. And again, I'm mixing the sound to the speaker, but this time I'm mixing it after a gain fader, after a volume fader. So now, when I lock my patch, can adjust the volume levels of the two sounds. So that's very useful. Put the comments back in here. This is a playlist tilde. This is a live.gain, even though it says so. We'll put a comment on it. And this is our ezdac. And again, I'm using the Option, click, and drag to duplicate these comments. And I'll just note here that this is a comment. And also want to note that when creating a new object, we use N for new object, box. So the next thing I want to introduce are messages. These are objects. Objects do things. These are sound players. These are volume faders. this is a sound output. A message that we create with the M key is a command that we send to an object. An object understands a message. For instance, the clear message. And note, when I typed in clear, it looked at nearby objects and said, oh, the playlist tilde understands the clear message. And you're creating this message box pretty close to a playlist tilde object, so I'm going to show you what that message will do. Remove all sound files. And another thing to note is it doesn't fix the width of the box when I type in the word clear. I can just click on the handles to make it wider, or there's a keyboard shortcut for that, which is Command J, that will resize your objects. You can also, there is an option to auto fix width here under options. I recommend leaving it off. Often you don't want Macs to automatically fix the width of your messages and your objects. I take the message box and connect it to the inlet of the playlist. The message has not been sent yet to the playlist. It's just the potential of it being sent. Because when we lock the patcher, a message box becomes a button. And if we click on the button, the message is sent. So when I click on the clear, the word clear, the actual text of that message, flows down this patch cable and enters the playlist tilde. And since the playlist tilde understands that message, it will act on it and clear out the sounds. So let's take a look at some other messages that we can apply to these playlists. A very simple message is which track to play. And we do that by sending a message that is an integer. An integer meaning a number with no fractional component. So if we want to play sound number 1, we put 1 in a message box, connect that message box to the inlet of the sound player, lock the patch. If we want to stop the sound, that's the pause message. And here it recognizes, playlist tilde understands pause. Command J to fix the width, put it in there, and now we have play and pause controls. And if we want a pause button on our right playlist, we can connect it there and connect it like so. Now, you're not going to know all the messages that objects understand, but there's a very easy way to see a full list of all the messages that an object understands. Unlock your patch, click the object, and click on the reference book. And this will pop open a sidebar that will show you all of the messages that that object understands. So here's clear that we've used. Here's int stands for integer. Stop playing a sound file. Oh, that's interesting. So if we send it a 1 again, it restarts the sound file. So this is slightly not correct. Next, we'll play the next sound file. Pause, we'll pause the playback as we saw here. Remove, the remove message will remove a clip. And down here there's a further description. The word remove followed by a clip number removes that clip from the list. Just test that out. Remove space 1. And it removes that clip, and it doesn't leave a blank space. And these messages can be deleted, causes no problem. So what if we want to start sounds simultaneously? Well, we can certainly take a message and send it to both objects. So this message, since it's connected to the inlets of both objects, will be sent to both objects. But if we want to start 2 different sound files at the same time, for instance, number 1 over here and number 2 over here, we have another object, user interface object, called a button that we create with the B key. So this is a button, and these are message boxes. Connect that button to the inlets, and notice there's two inlets to a message box. In order to have a button send the message, we want to connect the outlet of the button to the left inlet of the message box, and then the outlet of the message box to the object that's going to receive the message. And this is, we're starting to see a very important feature of Macs, is that information flows from top to bottom. So I press the button press flows down this patch cord and hits the message box. The message box reacts by sending its contents down this cord into the playlist tilde, which reacts by sending the sound down these patch cords through the live.gain, and then the volume adjusted sound is passed down these patch cords into the ezdac. And it's still going to work if you put the ezdac up here, but then it's messy and harder to read. So keeping your patches arranged in this top to bottom flow will help you understand what your patch is doing, particularly in the beginning. So I lock my patch and I click the button. It will play the second sound file from this playlist and the first sound file from this playlist. And already I'm interacting more using the buttons I created than going down here and interacting with these individual controls. And this is a principle that we're going to see a lot in Macs, is you're always building the way in which you want to interact with it. You're making message boxes for the important commands that you want at your fingertips, regardless whether those are the ones that happen to be built in to the user interface. We can also send messages to the live gain. We can change the audio level, and the audio level here is represented in decibels, where 0 decibels is no attenuation of the sound, to minus 70 decibels is silence. So we'll make a message box with minus 70 in it and connect it to the left inlet, and a message box with 0 in it and also connect it to the left inlet, and that will allow us to turn up and down the volume. And of course we can specify other volumes. So minus 6 dB is going to be roughly a perceptual halving of the volume of the sound. So minus 6. These messages are not necessarily easily readable, so one thing we can do is we can send a message to a message. And if we do that, we can create a button that has a more comprehensible message in it. So the message box does not understand the on message, so it treats it as if this were a button. So when I hit the on message, it sends the word on, down this patch cord to this message. And the message doesn't understand the on. It simply realizes that it received something, and since it received something that it didn't understand, it takes that as a button. And I can do the same thing here with off, connect that to my minus 70. And now I have a nice on button and off button and a quiet button. The next thing that we can do here, if we want the patch to be a little bit neater, hold down the Option key, select a group of things, and under the object menu, we can say hide on lock, which is also Command K. And stuff that we don't want to see, we can say hide on lock, Command K, and then when we lock the patch, that stuff disappears. I'm going to Command J these to make them a little bit smaller, and neaten this up a bit, and place it over here, lock my patch, and now I have a nice little volume control. This is not necessary, but it's part of building a good user interface, which is something you're going to want to do moving forward. One other feature of the live.gain that I want to show you is the live.gain has an ability to fade from one volume setting to another. I'm going to change my quiet setting to minus 12 dB because I'm not really hearing that minus 6 dB. And to do that, it's not a message to the live.gain, it's an attribute of the live.gain. So we see under this reference, in addition to messages, there's attributes that an object has. And the difference here is that messages are something we tell an object or ask an object to do, and attributes are a quality of that object. So I might say to a person, stand up. That's a message. I might say of a person, they're wearing a blue shirt. That's an attribute. And one of the attributes of the live.gain is interp, which is the ramp time, the time it takes to ramp to move from one volume level to another. And the default is 10 milliseconds, 1/100th of a second. That's really fast. It's slow enough that we're not going to hear a click, but we're not going to perceive that as a fade. We're not going to perceive that as a ramp. So we can take this and we can just drag it right from the reference. Or the more common way to do it is to hit the A key and create an attrui, an attribute user interface, and connect that to any inlet of the object that we want to control. Lock the patch, and now we have all the attributes here in a list. There's interp. And notice that it's called ramp time from this list. It's a little bit confusing that when we select ramp time, it puts the word interp in there because interp is actually the name of the attribute and ramp time is the description of the attribute. And this is in milliseconds, so it's in 1,000th of a second. So if we wanted a 2-second audio fade, that would be 2,000 milliseconds. 2,000 in a message box into our attrui, our attrui. You can pronounce it either way. And now, by clicking that message, I've sent my new time to the live.gain saying any volume transitions will take 2 seconds. That was a 2-second fade, and fade it back to quiet over 2 seconds. Well, it ended, but and then fade it up to full volume over 2 seconds. I sent this in as a message. I can also click and drag it in. And the way in which clicking and dragging works is if you click on the integer portion of the number, it will go up and down as integers. If you click to the right of the decimal point, you're able to change tenths. If you click further to the right, you're able to change hundredths. If you click further to the right, you're able to change thousandths. And of course, this is already in milliseconds, so it's these are extremely tiny fragments of time where you wouldn't use the floating point portion of the number here, but just so you know that that's possible. So if I type in 1000 here, this 2000 no longer applies. The interp time is 1 second. But if I were to click the message again, now my interp time is changed to 2 seconds. And the reason why I'm doing this with a message is because it's really unpleasant to work in milliseconds, to think in milliseconds. I mean, 30-second fade would be 30,000 milliseconds. That's not a nice number. So I'll show you an object that you're going to use all the time. I created it with n with the new object, and it's multiplication, simple multiplication, which is the asterisk, multiply two numbers. Space 1000, how much we want to multiply them by. And I put a decimal point after the 1000 because I want to do floating point math. I want to be able to say something like, in a message, 5.2 seconds. I'll connect that message to my times 1000, connect my times 1000 to my attrui, and now when I click this, 5.2 times 1000 is 5200, and that's a 5.2 second fade. And here I can have a 3.1 second fade. Connect that also, and now I can switch between my two fade times. And of course, if I want both attrui to have the same fade time, I can simply connect the attrui to both of them. This gets grayed out momentarily because right now they don't have matching values. I haven't changed this one yet, so it's still the default of just a few milliseconds. But as soon as I send it a new value, now both of these faders are executing a 3-second fade. Now both of them are executing a 5-second fade. So let's stop with audio for the moment. I'm going to save this. And we'll switch over to video and image. And I could definitely just start working right in this same patch with video and image. Or I could go over to my project window and add a new file to my project that's going to be my image patcher. I'm going to show you a totally different way to do it, which is to unlock your patch, select the stuff you'd not like to interact with right now, and go to Edit, Encapsulate. And it creates an object called P, which stands for patcher. P sound. And if I lock my patch and double click, here's everything I just did. It's inside P sound. Note that I didn't select the button, so the button stayed outside the encapsulation. And it automatically created an inlet here so that my button press will pass into my patcher, into what's called a sub patch. So I can still play my sound from outside. So let's undo this and go back, and I can choose multiple controls that I want to leave outside. For instance, maybe I want to leave my pause controls outside my subpatch. So Option, click and drag, Command Shift E is the shortcut for encapsulate or edit encapsulate. And now both my pause buttons and my start button are left outside the subpatch. lock my patch, double click, and now I see there's 3 inlets. There's an inlet to my left one, an inlet here to start my sound files, and an inlet to the right one. And if you forgot an inlet, you can just make a new one by saying new inlet. And now I have a 4th inlet to my patch, for instance, to control my fade time. We'll talk about this a lot more, but this is a handy way to clear up screen space and keep all your work and keep some controls outside of the subpatch, so you don't necessarily have to dive into the subpatch to control what's happening inside it. The other thing to notice here is, see how I typed this word sound in all capital letters? That's a convention I'm going to use throughout the class. Whenever it's a word that we make up, that we get to choose, I'm going to put it in all caps, because sometimes it gets hard to tell the difference. In programming, this is a very common problem. Is that a command that has to be spelled that way in order for the object to understand it, or is it just a word that I made up? And notice I already did that in here when I made these messages on, quiet, and off, because those are arbitrary words. The message box doesn't actually understand the word on. It just knows it's getting something. So I get to put whatever word I want in there. I can put yay and it'll work just as well. So whenever you see something in capital letters in a tutorial, that's because it's a word that we get to choose. The sound portion, whatever you want. So image functions very similarly to sound. We certainly can take an image and drag it directly into the patch, and it will come into the patch. However, it's optimal to open up our project window. Now, what happened here is I accidentally closed my project window at some point. It's gone. So I do need to open recent project, and nothing will change. It just reopens that project window. And I can take some images, drag them into my project, consolidate the project so that the files are actually copied into the project folder. Right now, those images I dragged in are not in my media folder, but when I consolidate and look at my folder again, now copies of those images are in the media folder of my project folder. And that's optimal for being able to share your files. Aha, my patcher is locked, so it gives me this message. Unlock the patcher. To unlock the patcher while dragging, press the Option key. So drag it in, hold down the Option key, and it gives me a couple of options here. This is the first one I want. Create an fpic object that loads. Yeah, and the easier thing to do here is just to unlock your patcher window when you're dragging things in, and then you don't have to do anything funny. And this does create an object. If we click here on the reference, we're seeing that this is an object called fpic. To display this image, we need to create a world. We do that with the jit.world object, and this is also something that we can give a name. Call it projector, because we want this probably to go to a projector. And it automatically creates a window called projector. And now where's the window? Where did it go? It fell behind. So if we want that window always to float on top, there's an attribute of jit.world called floating. enable floating window style. So we've looked at how to use the attrui to turn on an attribute. Lock my patch, and now this is a floating window. But there's another way to type attributes into an object. And the thing that's useful about that is that the attribute will always be there. You won't have to click it each time. So I can type at, meaning attribute, floating, space 1, and that will turn on the floating property of the window of this jit.world. And in this case, this is binary. So 1 means on or true, 0 means off or false or no. And I created this with n for a new object. So just like our audio processing, our image world needs to be turned on. And it gets turned on, in this case, with a message. The message of 1. Jit.world understands the message 1 to turn on. And you see the screen goes gray, indicating that it is now on. And we can turn it off with the message of 0. But there's a shortcut to that. There's a handy object called toggle that we create with the letter T that sends 1s and 0s. It sends 1 when we click it, and then it sends a 0 when we click it again. On, off. So the toggle is an on-off switch and is equivalent to having a 1 message and a 0 message. jit.gl.layer is how we add an image layer into our world. So I'll take my image, connect it to my layer, and since we only have one world, this jit.gl.layer knows that we want this layer to appear in the world we've named projector. So we create a button with the B key. So when we turn on our world with the toggle, we can now see that empty layer. We hit the button, and the image now appears on that layer. If we want another image that functions on the same layer, we can drag in another image and connect it to the same layer. Now notice an important difference here. These are image patch cords. They're green and black striped. In our sound patch cords are yellow and black striped. When you connect sound patch cords to the same inlet, they mix. When you connect image patch cords to the same inlet, they do not, because image is discrete, whereas sound is continuous. And what I mean by image is discrete is image always exists in a frame. There's a single frame of image. And if we're seeing those frames rapidly, that's what video is. Video is 24 or 30 or 15 frames per second of image. But it's just a series of still images, discrete still images. Whereas sound is actually a continuous flow of information. Digital sound is a representation of the position of the speaker cone of the headphones or speaker that you're listening on. It's also a representation of the diaphragm of the microphone the sound was recorded from. So it has to be continuous. It has to be a constant movement. Whereas images are these discrete things. So they don't mix at an inlet. They just alternate at an inlet. The last one that's gone in is the one that we're going to see. So when I send a new image in, the old image is replaced, not layered. But we have jit.gl.layer, which enables us to layer imagery. So let's take a look at another image source. We'll create a new layer, and we'll use jit.grab. And jit.grab grabs the image capture device, the camera. We connect the image output of the jit.grab into the jit.layer, turn it on with a toggle, lock the patch, turn it on, and now the camera is live. And hi everybody, there I am. Angle that a little bit. And jit.grab has an attribute called vDevice, where if you have more than one image captured device, you can switch between them. So this is my vDevice 0, and my iPhone is vDevice 2. And that's my iPhone image. And you can see the frame rate is excellent. If you have a webcam connected, that would be yet another vDevice. And so again, I got this. This is an attrui created with the A key. Also optionally created by clicking on jit.grab, going over here, and under the reference, just dragging the vDevice attribute in to your patcher. So obviously my camera is sitting on top of my other images. I can adjust which layer is on top by setting the layer attribute. And the layer with the higher number will appear on top. So now that these images are layer 4, they appear on top of the video, which is layer 0. Another attribute is the position of the layer. Position, I can move my live video layer around on the x-axis or the y-axis. There is no z-axis because of the default settings of jit.gl.layer, because it would be confusing to be moving things around with the layer as well as with the z-axis. And so here I'm modifying the position of the still image layer. And again, here it comes into play because 1 is a very large amount. So we're not interacting with integers here. Here we're interacting with floating point numbers. So clicking to the right of the decimal place moves it in tenths. Clicking further to the right moves it in hundredths. And we get smooth motion when we're moving it in thousandths, or even tens of thousandths of a unit. So the further you click to the right, the finer your control over these values is. And video is the same. We take our video files, put them into our project, drag them into the project. From the project, drag them into the patch. The patch has to be unlocked. And again, unfortunately can't drag multiple from the project, but can bring them in one at a time. And this creates a jit.playlist object. Which can be sent directly to a jit.gl.layer. In fact, we can just copy this entire structure down here. Jit.gl.layer, play a video, and I've put that video on layer 5, so it's sitting on top of all the other layers. And the same positioning applies to that layer. And the other thing that you kind of obviously want to do here is scale. And scale means we need to introduce an additional concept. If I get the scale attribute here, I can stretch it along the x-axis, I can stretch it along the y-axis, but oddly, I don't have a proportional control. So how do I achieve proportional control? Well, I want to set the scale of the x and the y simultaneously. So in a message box, I can type a list. A list is simply multiple values separated by spaces. So if I want the x and the y both to be set to 2, I can type 2 space 2, and now I've created a proportional scaling difference. 3 space 3, now it's triple size. Back to 1 space 1 is normal size. If I want that to be interactive, though, I need to create this list. I can't send those two numbers in individually to the scale. So I'm going to show a new object called pack. And pack simply takes its two inputs and combines them into a list. You have to specify what kind of input you want. We want floating point input. We want input that has a fractional component. So we say pack f space f. And this creates an object with 2 inlets and 1 outlet. We put the outlet into our destination. I'm going to get rid of that. And now we'll use the F key to create floating point number boxes. Make these wider so that we can get to that right side of the decimal point. These are float number box. And as you might guess, if you want whole numbers, that's I for an integer number box. And now I can change my scale, but nothing happens. Why is that? And this brings us to another key thing in Max, is that Max is a right-to-left language, and the left inlet of almost all objects is the hot inlet. So if I want my scale to be 3 by 2, it's not going to send that message until I've entered both things. So it will always change in response to the left inlet, but the right inlet will simply store its value until something arrives in the left inlet. One way to bypass that is to simply attach a button that will cause both values to be sent. And in our case, there's an even simpler solution, which is just to use the same number box to both inlets of the pack, because we want proportional scaling. That's our goal. So this sends our value, here 1.371, first to the right inlet where it's stored, and then to the left inlet where the pack operation is triggered and the list is created. There is also a pack object with 2 hot inlets. Pack without the C, both inlets are hot. So I can now change my X and my Y interactively. And pack is a useful object. It shows up a lot. Pack with a C is the more common object, because typically you don't want both inlets to be hot. If both inlets were hot in this case, the message would be sent twice, which would be redundant and in some cases could cause the computer to do additional work. Once you get a composition you like, how do you save the values? There's an object called preset. I create it with the new object box, preset. and it gives you these tiny little buttons. The first thing I tend to do when I create a preset is to open the object inspector, that's this eye in a circle, and change its slot size to a larger slot. So you have like this slightly larger squares there. And that's another way of changing an attribute, is in this inspector. The attributes all appear here as a list. And if I want to save every user interface object, I simply hold down Shift and click one of these spaces, and it's saved. And then I can make some changes here. I'll move this over there, and I'll scale this down, and I'll move myself further off the screen, and Shift-click slot 2. Now I've saved all the user interface objects on the screen to slot number 2, and I can just switch back and forth between those compositions. And if I make any changes, I can Shift-click again, and it will overwrite the previous values. If I want something totally different, click in another one. Now I have 3 different presets. And you see it's literally changing the user interface objects. That's what it's storing. It's storing the state of these objects. And one really useful thing about the preset is if there's something you don't want to save, you can use the middle outlet, connect to objects to exclude from a preset. So like, let's say we don't want the preset to be able to actually turn on and off the video processing. Then I connect the middle outlet of my preset to the toggle of my jit.world and re-record all 3 of these. And now the state of this toggle is not saved. I can turn it on and off independently of the presets. And this is very useful. You're going to use this all the time. And I guess the one other thing that I should show you before we wrap up is tinting and transparency of layers. And we do that through the color attribute of the layer. So I'll make a new attrui here, connect it to the layer that I want to adjust the tint or transparency of. Choose color. It comes in as GL_color. And here I can click on the color and it brings up my color inspector, and I can remove red from the layer, or remove green, or remove blue, or adjust the opacity of the layer, which will make it transparent, faded out, faded in. This is a little hard to interact with, so what you can do is click on your attrui, go back to this inspector that we just saw, and change the display mode to multi-number float. And now our attrui has red, green, blue, and transparency. Which is also called alpha. And we can interact with those numerically. And similarly, we can use our pack structure here, now with 4 values. To fade red, green, and blue, which is our fade to black feature here. And notice if you go above 1, it's going to blow the image out. 1 is normal, 0 is faded to black, 0.5 is half brightness. And here's our transparency. And note that it's not working because of the right-to-leftness issue. So we can do that trick where we add a button that triggers that as well. And now we have transparency control interacting with brightness control. And one final thing I'll show you, if you don't want to push this over 1 and get a blown out image, you might want to because it's pretty interesting looking, but if you don't want that, and you don't want to go into useless ranges with your transparency, negative doesn't mean anything, and values greater than 1 don't mean anything. The only useful values are between 0, faded out, and 1, faded in. You can go and highlight these objects, go over to this inspector again. In the inspector, you can set a minimum value of 0 and a maximum value of 1. And I highlighted both of these number boxes, so they both will have a minimum value of 0 and a maximum value of 1. So when I drag them down, they stop at 0. And when I drag them up, they stop at 1. And this will also process incoming values. If we pass values through this number box, they will be clipped to a minimum value of 0 and a maximum value of 1, which is very useful. Save your work and consolidate your project so that all of your files that you've added to the project are copied to your media folder, and then this becomes a shareable, uploadable folder that contains everything necessary to run your patch. And typically, if you're going to want to share something like this, you will want to compress it into a zip before you share it. For this class, try to keep your file size a couple hundred megabytes. So please contact me for any questions, clarifications. Remember that this is just the very, very beginning. We're just scratching the surface here. This is some basic stuff, but it's very, very important stuff. I know this is dense. I know it's a lot of material. Please revisit this video several times so that you can get this stuff under your hands, and possibly revisit it again in a couple of weeks, because there's going to be stuff in here that you didn't necessarily grasp the import of this time around, but as you continue to work with Macs, it'll become much more obvious how they're going to be useful.